Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's John O'Connell. I'm the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, and we're here today to talk about a not insubstantial topic of the future of conservatism. With an election looming, obviously the Conservatives have seen some probably slightly cheerier polls more recently, so maybe the party are feeling things are up for grabs a bit more. So the future of conservatism is an important discussion to have, I suppose, regardless of the outcome of the election anyway. And we're joined today by a star guest, Lord Frost, who's a former British diplomat and a civil servant, Minister of State, a former Minister of State at the Cabinet Office, and of course was the chief negotiator of the Brexit task force. Just a sort of housekeeping note, I'll talk to Lord Frost for a little while, and then I'll be doing our classic substitution for the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Mark Littlewood, who will pick up in the second half, and then we'll open out for Q&A a bit later on. So, Lord Frost, I wanted to start naturally for the Taxpayers Alliance on the issue of tax. It seems to be something that crops up at every conference, and we've seen, of course, over the weekend, some Conservative MPs have spoken quite openly that they won't vote for any future increases to the tax burden. I was interested to read your piece recently in the Telegraph talking about taxes, and you seem to indicate that it doesn't really matter what tax should be cut, but we should just cut a tax and cut it soon. Could you sort of expand on that and talk about the difference between just, as the headline had it, starving the beast, or more strategic tax cuts?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today. I mean, there's a lot to say about the future of conservatism generally, but I think one of the problems we've got is that we are losing the arguments about markets and small state versus state direction and a large state, and where that argument is going on within the Conservative Party as well as more broadly in politics. And that's why this argument about taxation is so important. It's not the only aspect of a large versus small state, obviously, but it's the most symbolic part of it. Now, I mean, to answer your question directly, I think, if the politics was in place, everybody wanted a smaller state, everybody wanted a lower tax burden, there was no argument about it, then you'd have the room to have a proper discussion about, okay, what's the right way of doing it, where do we want the cuts to come. But we're obviously not in that position, and I think we therefore need to realise that if the politics is in place to do a tax cut of some kind, we should take it, because we believe in starving the beast. We want to get the state smaller. We want to prove by reality that it works. So, if inheritance tax is what's on offer, and that's what the party leadership thinks it can do, and who knows, it doesn't look like we're going to see it in the next few days anyway. If that's what's on offer, then take it and begin to squeeze the state.
And the reaction to a tax cut of any kind, even in a theoretical sense, even when it's suggested, is seems to me to be part of the problem, that people talk about the distributional impacts of tax changes without talking about the growth-enhancing impact of tax changes. How important is it to change that conversation? Because distributional impacts are interesting in and of themselves, but they seem to hinder a lot of forward movement in this area.
Yeah, I mean, we're losing this argument completely. Unfortunately, the argument is quite a complicated one, and it needs to be part of a broader debate about small state economic liberalisation and so on that we've just not had for a long time. Which is why we're in this sort of statist world where it is thought that the government bears quite a high degree of responsibility for income distribution in the whole of society, and therefore tax cuts, the tax burden becomes part of that. We do need to get away from that, otherwise there's no end to the argument in which the government sets income distribution. So we do need to get away from that, but it's part of a bigger argument that we are unfortunately not winning at the moment.
There's a tension there between freedom and security, and obviously in the pandemic, I was quite surprised with how quickly people sort of welcomed draconian government action. Did Liberals misread the room on that one? Is the country much less liberal than we thought?
I mean, I don't think it is particularly liberal, unfortunately. And if you look at the British social attitudes polling that came out last week, there's definitely been a move towards collectivism since 2016, whenever they last did the poll. But actually, if you go back to the 80s, the country's always been fairly collectivist against those questions. It dipped a bit during the heyday of the Major and Blair governments, but not by much. So we've always had to operate against that kind of backdrop. And I think the pandemic, I would say things like net zero, the repeated bailouts or pressure for bailouts, all kind of reveal this fact rather than create it. So we've got to accept we are operating in that environment, and therefore we've got to persuade by doing as well as through abstract arguments.
So that's interesting, because the follow-on consequence at the moment is, of course, if a government minister is on the radio or on the television, they're berated. What are the government going to do about this? Whatever it is, what is the government going to do about it?
Yeah.
I don't really hear a Conservative politician saying, well, nothing. It's not our job. We're talking about personal responsibility, etc., etc. I'm sure they've got comms teams telling them that they've got to, show off about how much they've spent, etc. So, in order to make this case, is it Conservative politicians themselves having more guts to talk about personal responsibility and freedom and these kinds of things?
I definitely. It drives me mad, actually. The email we get every day, if you're in the party, for the sort of lines to take for the day, what are the announcements, what to say about them. So often we are spending so many million or billion on Project X, isn't that good? And that is just the wrong way to frame the argument. And actually a lot of the announcements about this conference have been exactly the same. It's been spending money. And I know Greg Hans keeps saying there really isn't any money, and we just have got to model that debate ourselves. I think we can't expect to persuade others if all our arguments are about the sort of cash point that just keeps on giving.
Yeah, and talking of spending, of course, during the Blair and Brown years, the average rate of public spending, not including government interventions on the global financial crisis, was 37.6%, and the Conservative and Coalition average, minus the pandemic response, is 41.5%. So quite a big jump of about 4 percentage points in terms of average spending over the time. Spending's the real problem here, isn't it?
Yes, it is, obviously. And again, we are just not making the argument. And I think it is too easy to say, as so many people are saying, that, well, we've got an ageing population, well, we've got, this, that and the other. You must expect the tax burden always to go up because spending pressures are always going to go up. I think that is just too easy. I think it's an intellectual rationalisation of something that people prefer not to push hard against. Unfortunately, not all spending on health, not all spending on social care, not all spending on pensions has to go through the public sector. We've chosen to do it that way. We produce the high spending and tax burden, and then we crush the economy by doing so. And it is a huge intellectual and political effort to get off that track. But if we don't get off it, then the country's only going in one direction.
Yeah, and a bit of a theme developing. Conservative Home have a series of articles about reducing the demand for government. Lots of people with some excellent ideas about that, but is there a sense that that's putting the cart before the horse slightly? Is it easier, better, more preferable just to start reducing the supply of government?
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, we must try and make the arguments and win the arguments for a smaller state. Let's get it back down to the size of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. It seems ridiculous to have to be saying that. I think reducing demand for government is always going to be difficult. We have to take the lead. We have to have the intellectual conviction that says shrinking supply, a smaller state, leaving more to personal responsibility and freedom, does the job. That is, I thought, what we believed as Conservatives, and I'd just like us to be saying it a bit more.
How much damage has been done to that line of thought and the idea that tax cuts are good for growth from what happened last year? I believe in this stuff. I can keep making the case, but are people listening? After such a short space of time from last year.
So I think it obviously did do some damage. There's no point in denying that. I don't think this has been as bad as I thought. I think the problem, as we were saying, is the general intellectual backdrop rather than necessarily particular incidents. I mean, in a way, I've been reassured by the way the kind of growth coalition and the need for growth is kind of bubbling up again. You hear lots of people saying, at least in this world, which I didn't expect them to be saying quite so quickly, Liz Truss got it right. She just got the methodology wrong. She was trying to do the right things, but in a somewhat ham-fisted, ill-prepared way. And I think one of her problems was that she didn't realise people didn't understand what she was trying to do, and a lot more preparing the ground and talking and explaining was necessary than was given. But I'm not so down about the last year. I think the argument's still there to be made.
Okay. And let's say that we manage to cut some taxes, reduce state expenditure, reduce that demand for government and reduce its supply. The big questions on reforms to things like pensions, healthcare, welfare, the things that will dominate public spending in the years to come. How tricky is it actually, even if we shrink the state in terms of figures, how can we actually get anything done? Is the state machine now so powerful and intransigent to any sort of change that it kind of doesn't matter what we do?
Well, I do think that we need some broader reforms to the state machine, certainly, that give ministers more grip and more kind of political oomph through the system when a government is elected to do certain things. But I think the bigger problem is the politics in those areas, that we're just living with this assumption that those numbers always go up and there's really nothing we can do about it. And that is the job of politicians, people who think about politics, to change that situation.
And the idea of reforming the civil service maybe, and scrapping quangos that are no longer performing their function and all of this kind of stuff, it's not necessarily top of the list of priorities for voters. So do you feel it's a case of pushing it up their list of priorities by talking about it more? Or do you think it's sort of more the government needs to get on with it in the background and make it happen so that they can act other policies that are probably electorally more popular anyway?
I mean, I think it should now be a top priority. Government modernisation. If we were in a situation where we were about to win another election and had another term in front of us, I would be saying we should now be preparing a Government Modernisation Act that sort of changes the Northcote-Trevelyan system, gives ministers direct levers in controlling budgets, bringing in staff, appointing staff, able to run the machine. So in a way that is just not possible at the moment. I mean, obviously we're not in that situation, but when we are, and I think the work is still worth doing, that legislation needs to be prepared, thought through, be ready to go on day one, so there's no argument about it. And again, as you say, you don't get bogged down doing it all. But I don't think it should be a background thing. I think it's now a big enough problem that we need to tackle this up front in its own right.
Yeah, and there's a slight problem within the Conservative movement, probably small c Conservative movement itself, when Labour recently recommended giving more power to the OBR. If they're elected, they will have more power to the Office for Budget Responsibility. And that was cheered on and praised by some Conservatives. I think George Osborne, not least, said it was sensible and pragmatic. So there's a problem within the Conservative movement itself in enacting some of this stuff, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, I sort of wonder whether some of these people really want to be in power in any meaningful sense at all. It's as if, they just sort of, their vision of power is to set up a bunch of institutions and rules and sort of wind it up and then let it go. And it produces the results that it produces. And the politics, taking politics out of government seems to be an aspiration for a good chunk of this party, unfortunately, and I don't think it should be like that. I do think that the Brexit wars have made it worse, in the sense that every time you criticise an institution, people say you're being populist, you don't care about rules, you don't care about good government, you just want to kick the whole thing over, and that makes it worse. But I do think that we need to sort of get serious about the powers that enable us to implement an actual political project when we have such a project, which at the moment we don't really, but I hope one day we will, and be able to drive it through.
Because it's interesting, it's sort of aping the technocratic, unelected European Union that people voted to leave. This sense that you just hand over power to sort of faceless suits and let them run the country instead. I mean, that tension within the Conservative movement seems to be quite key in driving a lot of this change. I mean,
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is legacy from EU membership, and we've got used to this very attenuated democracy where the connection between a vote and anything actually happening has got very, very weak. Obviously, after Brexit, we can change that, but I think that is part of it. But I do think there's something else going on, which is that there is this government knows best mood around at the moment, which is very strong, that give powers to the establishment, to technocrats, to civil servants, whoever. They will do it better than letting ordinary people just get on with their lives, and I think that's part of the problem as well here.
Okay. And we focused a lot on the tension, maybe healthy tension, between Conservatives and Liberals, and being able to talk and discuss these ideas. Is it actually time to think more about the old US fusionism approach, and actually saying we ought to put down our swords and think about the enemies on the other side? When should the Conservative movement stop focusing on itself and start focusing on the other?
I mean, it definitely should, but we need to define the project if we're going to do that successfully. And to come back to the title of the session, the future of conservatism, it seems to me there are like three big intellectual trends that have gone on in the last 20, 30 years, which it ought to be the job of this party to stop and reverse. And one of them is the thing we were talking about at the start, this statism versus free market, small versus big government, the feeling that government always knows best in your lives. That's one of them. I think the second one is about it's got established that society is not made up of free individuals and families and kind of the sorts of social connections that have prevailed for hundreds of years, but it's about groups, it's about group rights, it's about trying to sustain your position by defining yourself as part of a group and then getting the government to sort of support that. And that is a big change in how we think about society. So that's the second. And then I think third is, again, we've touched on it a bit, it's about the nation state. The devaluation of the nation state in favour of a, I don't really like the words, but a sort of globalist kind of belief that the nation state is no longer the best way of organising your democratic affairs, but it's better organised through sort of overlapping sovereignties, international institutions, kind of unelected bureaucrats of various kinds. So those are the three trends. And I think they are, I would say, and I can expand on the point, I think they're all sort of regressions rather than progressive, as they are so often defined. It should be the job of this party to push back on all of those. Now, some people are more interested in working on one of those trends than others, if you like, or it chimes with them. But I think we should all support each other in pushing back on them, provided we're going in the right direction. There's no point in a project that doesn't settle the argument about do we believe in a small state or a big state. If we're just kind of losing it if we do that. If we can't settle the argument about group rights and sort of wokeism against individuals and freedom and the family and so on, then we're not going to be successful. So there is a minimum defining of the project that needs to be done, I think. But as we do that, we all need to kind of recognise some things are more important to some Conservatives than others and support each other to produce a meaningful project.
Lord Frost, that sort of concludes my section. I'm going to seamlessly substitute for Mark Littlewood now.
Thanks.
John, thanks very much. David, great to have you with us in Think Tent. I'm going to pick up on a few of the themes that John asked about, but I guess if we're going to talk about the future of conservatism, we should also look at the immediate past of conservatism. There must be such an array to pick from, but what would you say the greatest crowning achievements of 13 years of Conservative rule have been?
Restoration, more or less, of national independence and the British nation state. And we don't talk about democracy as the achievement of Brexit enough. I would say education, schools in particular in England, where there is clearly a change in performance and standards over time, and I think that's a big difference. And Michael Gove obviously deserves a lot of the credit for driving that through. After that, I start to hesitate, if I'm honest, about what we have done during these 13 years.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because, I mean, I suppose if you wanted to be generous to the Conservatives, you'd say there was a whole range of difficult things to deal with. I mean, the first explanation was hampered for 5 years by the Liberal Democrats, although I think unhampered by the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives have shifted radically to the left, actually. Yeah. But then you've had the whole Brexit farrago, which was, ultimately carried out by the Conservative Party, but was a populist, sort of popular movement rather than Conservative Party policy at the outset. You've had COVID and such like, but it beggars belief, doesn't it, that with a year to go to the general election, we've got taxes at the highest level since Clement Attlee, government spending at the highest level ever, regulation harder to measure, I guess. You can't quantify it as easily as tax and spend, but I think by any metric we're more heavily regulated than we've been at any time in our lives. How did that come to pass? I mean, I guess I'm a kind of libertarian utopian, but I wasn't expecting libertarian utopia after 13 years. But I was kind of hoping, regulation might fall somewhat, spending might be got under control, budgets might be balanced, taxes might actually edge downwards rather than upwards. Why has there been that drift in? A Martian would assume we'd had 13 years of a centre-left government.
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, there have been events which have got in the way of some of this, and it's fair to recognise that. I think that unless you are making a very strong counter-argument for a small state, for a free economy, for markets, for free individuals, then everything's going to drift in the other direction because of this backdrop of collectivism, and that's where lack of thought takes you in that direction, and we have not provided enough of a counter-argument, I suppose, to make a difference. I do think, in an odd way, I wonder whether Brexit has contributed to this, because so much of our self-identification in the EU and in the debates within the EU was the economic liberal. we were the free trader, we were the country that pushed back on regulation, all this sort of thing. Now, we probably did that rather unsuccessfully over time. But nevertheless, that's what we did. That was our role, and it forced ministers and officials to make those arguments. We no longer have to, and there's no longer any countervailing pressure that stops us just sort of drifting with the tide, and indeed I think that's what we've done.
Going on as we speak, there was a queue snaking right round the block, is this growth rally over in the Midland with former Prime Minister Liz Truss, Priti Patel, Jacob Rees-Mogg also speaking, and Ranil Jayawardena, the former Trade Secretary. I popped my head round the door. They've got this rather cheeky slogan on their banners, "Make Britain Grow Again," which I think is the kind of, the translating MAGA over here into British politics. Do you think Liz Truss and that group are right to say growth is the silver bullet? That's the thing we've taken our eye off the ball about. Just look how feeble it's been. Okay, COVID hit and there was the financial crisis, but really it's been pretty pathetic this century, right? Not just a couple of years of retreat. Is that the magic bullet? Do you buy that strategy? That if we can find a mix of policies to get long-run GDP growth rates up to, 2.5%, 3%, hardly hugely optimistic numbers by historical standards, just a reversion to the norm, that sort of everything else falls into place. Has Liz Truss correctly identified that as the main thing that policy's got to be driven at?
Yeah, I think she has. I should say, if I wasn't already committed to this, they did ask me to go to that, and I very much agree with what that group is trying to do in terms of getting this to the top of the agenda. Now, it's not the only thing, obviously, that the country needs to do, but it is, I think, a prerequisite to doing most things successfully. And many of the problems that we've got at the moment, we would not feel we had if we were growing by 2.5%, 3%. We just would not have the social conflict. We would not have some of the group rights issues. We wouldn't have the strikes in the same way. I think all these are symptoms of an economy that people don't feel is going to grow very much, and therefore you need to get your share of it. And the sort of zero-sum mentality, which is the natural mentality of humankind. That's why I say this is a regression, not a progressive. We got to change that. We've sort of drifted into thinking that growth is this sort of magical exogenous thing that just comes and you can't really do anything about it. You can do a lot about it, but we have to grasp it and do something.
I want to pick up a bit. It won't surprise you to know I roughly agree with that analysis, that it might not be a silver bullet to everything, but it's one hell of a bronze bullet, right? It mitigates an awful lot of problems if you've got the economy ticking along at a nice sort of 3% or so growth rate. But I want to delve a bit deeper into a question that John put to you. This sort of ratchet effect, the nature of the demographics, the fact, it's a point I make in the Times today, that we've got a demographic problem and we have been involved in a vast amount of can kicking. So if you were to look at our future liabilities around health, around social care, around public sector pensions,
horrific.
Absolutely eye-watering. But sort of, the natural thing is that tax will remain extremely high. Now, you sort of said to John, we mustn't be negative about that, but I'm trying to work out what the solution to that is. If you're going to carry that pension, welfare and health burden, I can't really easily see a way in which you can meaningfully cut taxes and thereby encourage entrepreneurialism. We have a vast albatross around our neck, not just on, I almost don't bother looking at the year-on-year budget deficits anymore. They're rounding errors compared to the long-term liabilities. I think one estimate, 2.6 trillion in public sector pensions.
Yes, on that alone.
So is there a danger that on our side of the argument we're involved in this sort of magical thinking, that we can just sort of, if we sort of get a bit more free market and capitalist, these problems will go away? Or do health, welfare and pensions need to be tackled, need to be diminished radically as part of state expenditure.
Yeah, they do. I think growth, at the moment in the kind of economy we've got, I think of it's like the sort of oil in the engine. It makes it start ticking better. It works more smoothly. It becomes a bit more powerful. But you've still got to tackle the underlying difficulties. And without, I would say, a gradual shift over a generation of our health system to a more European style one, we're just going to see the budgets continuing to grow. We obviously need to, in my view, trim some of the, quite a lot of the marginal stuff that the NHS now does. It appears to be taking on this burden of, at any moment, this burden of social care, the sort of vast unknown mental health crisis that we've suddenly stumbled into. All these, are things that we just do not have the capacity to fund, and sort of need to shrink the borders. Similarly, I think the vastly growing universal credit system needs to be trimmed back. Pensions are put into a slightly different category in the sense that the incentive effects on the economy of changing pensions in the short run are obviously much weaker because people have fewer options. But I do think that the honest truth is that the pension age is going to have to go up quite a long way to solve this problem. That seems to me the best way of getting at it over the medium term.
So what sort of, ballpark, what sort of reductions in expenditure you were imagining? So let's forward wide, 5 years, and assume that the Conservatives have left office and have returned. What sort of package of measures are you suggesting? Because health spending is bound to go up, right? That's a feature of just becoming a richer country. It might be that it's in the private sector rather than in the public sector. Yeah. But the richer you get, not just the more you spend on health, the higher proportion of your income you spend on health, right? So you could well imagine in 100 years' time, it's 25 or 30% of GDP, let's say, being spent on health. What nature of cuts, other than, bumping the state pension age up slowly to 70, would you have in mind?
Or 75, yeah. I quite a lot higher. People are healthier, much healthier than they used to be, and I think it does need to go up. The big blocks of spending are health, pensions, and benefits. Mm-hmm. If you don't tackle those, then you're not really tackling anything. I do think, as I said, you need to do something like freezing or coming close to freezing the public sector health budget and finding a sort of socially just and accepted way that future spending needs to go into the private sector in some way. Otherwise, it's just going to absorb we'll be up at sort of half of the budget before too long. I would say, we spend £1 trillion in public spending at the moment. If we were feeling we're taking like 100 billion out of that over a parliament, that feels like an achievable thing that would make a difference, right, but would no doubt be extremely hard to do in practice.
Now, we touched on Brexit. How would you audit the Brexit dividend to date?
I feel like, honestly, I think if I was marking it, I would say it's sort of 8 out of 10.
Oh, as good as that?
I think so. I think we've talked ourselves into a lot of gloom over Brexit in a way that's not justified. There is this kind of popular belief that trade has collapsed, growth has collapsed, that firms are all grappling with horrific paperwork at the borders and so on. And obviously there are elements of that. No one's ever said there wouldn't be a short-run cost. But to me, considering we have changed the entire economic model of the country pretty well overnight, it stood up pretty well. We now need to grab the opportunities, and they're the familiar things. There are deregulation, they're getting to a smaller stage, they are signing more trade deals and making more of them around the world. But I think we've talked ourselves into believing it's failing. Well, I don't really see any evidence of that, to be honest. The one area where I am doubtful is Northern Ireland, obviously, where I wish we hadn't got stuck in this Windsor framework thing, but we are stuck in it for the time being, and it's going to be a problem.
So do you think the opportunities, I would agree with you that, I don't know, I'm wondering whether I reached the conclusion that as far as the EU is concerned, the emperor has no clothes. It doesn't seem to make a blind bit of difference whether you're a member of the EU or not. You know, the Remain side were promising us, you know, locusts and famine and the horsemen of the apocalypse and Godzilla rising from the River Thames and God knows what else if we voted to leave. It doesn't seem to me it's changed at all. And I know sort of both sides of the Brexit debate still sort of forensically go through the data and try and work out whether we're growing at 0.1% more than France or 0.2% less. It seems to be, we're in about the same position as if we'd stayed in, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so, which is, as I say, considering we've changed the entire model.
That is of itself an achievement that we haven't gone backwards.
It's not bad, but we do need to make more of it now, and that is an area whether we've got to change our, as I was saying, our political system and the way we do politics and what is possible to make the most of that. I also think actually immigration, this is an area where sort of free market liberals have got to think hard really about this. I do think that I suspect that one of the reasons the short-term economy is held up is the vast number of immigrants that we've had over the last couple of years, and I don't think that's sustainable. So all the more need to do domestic liberalisation and reform.
Now, you touched with John about some of the sort of what you might call woke, or that everybody now identifies within a group, potentially then takes on victimhood within that group and then argues for as high a slice of a diminishing pie as they can get their hands on. Do you think the whole terms of debate to the frustration of, say, the IEA and the Taxpayers Alliance, it's just moving away from economics? Everything's culture wars now. It's not really, sort of discussions about tax and spend and balancing the budget and, efficient regulation. These seem to be sort of somewhat on the fringes. And everything's about, critical race theory, trans issues. These are the sort of dominant controversial issues that get the blood boiling. If that shift's happened, is that a disaster for Conservatives or a welcome way to sort of win some battles?
So I don't think they're completely separate things. I think we've got to recognise that politics is about values as well as pure economics, and that's just a shift that has happened, and we've got to accept that and have conservative principles on values as well as the economy. But I do think they are connected. I think this sort of belief in growth the group rights, the duty of the government to protect and support groups, to eliminate discrimination, to be responsible for, as we said at the start, the kind of distribution of income within the country and sort of fairness. That is part of the economic problem as well. And if we don't get back to the vision of free individuals within a set of inherited traditions trying to make the best of their lives for themselves, then we are going to see growth go down even further. So I guess I don't see they're disconnected.
John also mentioned a bit about, it's a year on. I still bear the scars of last year's Conservative conference when it seemed that a government that was in broad terms, trying to lower taxes, perhaps get spending under control, or there's been some criticism that was never happening, and deregulate sort of completely imploded and was beginning to implode at the time of the Conservative conference last year. It behoves us, doesn't it, to really, without engaging in too much self-flagellation, but to really understand what went wrong. Because if that was an attempt to get a sort of reformist agenda, it didn't make it to the launch pad. Now, you sort of mentioned, perhaps it was done in a ham-fisted way. I want to unpick that a bit. What do you specifically think the problem was? Was there not enough attention on sequencing? What's the number one priority, and then we'll leave the number two priority a few weeks down the line? I say, I think the Oscar-winning film last year was Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, and that seemed to sort of sum up the approach of the Truss administration. But was it that? Or if you listen to Liz Truss herself or others in the administration, and one can go down a rabbit hole here, but the institutional infrastructure of the United Kingdom is just geared against policy reform. Doesn't mean it's unachievable, but it means a misstep can be absolutely fatal, that you're pushing against the grain of all of these OBRs and the Treasury model and the IMF and everything else. Where do you think that, what's your audit of it a year on about why it unravelled so quickly, and what needs to be done to make sure that doesn't happen again when there's another window for radical reform?
So I think the case for the ambition and energy with which the Truss government came in and tried to tackle these problems was to be able to say, look, we get it. We need to increase the growth rate. If we've got to let the deficit take the strain for a bit, if we've got to sort of be a little bit less robust on spending, then it's worth it because it's going to get the growth rate up, and then we will start to resolve some of these problems, and with some of the other aspects will come later. Now, they didn't explain that, and it looked just like kind of lack of discipline, lack of understanding. But I still think there is a case for trying to show the world that Britain is on a different path, that we want growth to go. We are going in a different direction from the last few years. Obviously that's not going to happen over the next year, but I still think it's necessary if we want to get investment, get people looking at the country, get the brand of Britain changed, which I do think is important. So that was I don't think it was entirely misguided or kind of just sort of not thought through what was happening, but it was a wrong call. I do think there was a lot of lack of explaining and trying to explain why growth was important, how you get to it, and explaining that we got on the wrong path and it needed to change. I do agree with your point about institutional infrastructure, and there was a lot of hysteria around in that period, that we'd elected another sort of populist crazy government that was about sort of kick out and sort of smash up all these carefully designed institutions. Who knew what was going to happen? And therefore the very mild criticisms of the bank seemed to loom larger. The removal of Tom Scholar suddenly seemed to be like this sort of huge explosion in the middle of the civil service. So I do think there was a lot of institutional resistance, and I guess I would say they should have anticipated that, and maybe gone a bit more slowly, maybe explained a bit better what they were trying to do. I do regret the fact personally that Liz didn't stick at it, and that I think it was possible to drive it through. Stick to her guns, make some compromises, okay, but stick to the guns. But as soon as she abandoned the tax cuts, as soon as Jeremy Hunt was appointed as Chancellor, it was obvious the game was up, and I think that's a pity.
Now, you mentioned, again, preparing the ground, or the argument wasn't made. A great frustration of mine over many years that I've shared at endless events in these sort of marquees at Conservative conferences is you'll hear a leading Conservative politician, Prime Minister, Chancellor, whatever, begin a speech, and the first paragraph or so is, we need to make the case again for free market capitalism, and we need to prepare the ground again and make the case again for free market capitalism. And my sort of, I perk up a bit at this point, and I think this, and then they don't. Then the second paragraph is some new government spending scheme, or how we're going to spend more money on this, or regulate that, or ban the other. Do you actually think, if we might be some way away from a government of any stripe that's going to be seriously reforming, that a lot of the task of those of a free market capitalist persuasion is probably doing a little less in terms of prescription and a bit more in terms of analysis, simply pointing out where things are wrong, the unsustainability of the public finances. Because if people aren't aware of that, don't buy into that reality, they're going to reject reform. Do you think we need to just do a lot more of explaining the extraordinarily difficult position the British economy is in unless surgery is conducted? Because using that surgery analysis, people, if somebody knows they're ill, they'll happily go under the knife and have some surgery. But you're not going to persuade them to have surgery if they don't believe they're ill, right? So do you think we need to reframe our arguments in that way to prepare the ground?
I mean, I do. I think politics, obviously, people who are in politics at the moment, it's got very managerial. It's become about keeping the show on the road, a set of tactical decisions, trying to unite the Conservative Party rather than to put forward any actual projects. And we need a project, we need a vision, we need the leader to explain to us how Conservative Britain will be different from Labour Britain and why. We're not getting that at the moment, and as you say, people are not making the arguments. I do think I feel like I spend a lot of my time kind of criticising the government, and I wish I didn't have to, but part of the reason I do is exactly the point you make, that the sort of intellectual integrity requires you to say that some of these things are not going to work. But I do feel that there are people who, like me, who would be more pointed making these points. But there is pressure not to rock the boat, keep the show on the road. Let's not give up yet. I think that's part of the reason. I'm sure if we do lose, we're going to see a massive explosion of debate and argument and pressure in this direction, undoubtedly, afterwards.
Before I come to the audience for some questions, and we've got some microphones at the back, so if you'd like to ask a question, do catch my eye. A little bit, what are your plans for the future? I think you once Riley said to me that you lived your career in reverse order.
Yeah.
And are you going to continue to live it in reverse order and depart the House of Lords and maybe enter the House of Commons? Is that where you see your future?
So it's possible. I'm on the candidates list. I haven't applied for any seats yet, but perhaps I will in the next few months. It's a one-way trip out of the Lords, and you can never go back. So I don't want to do it unless it's kind of the right thing. I guess I would say, I've kind of drifted into politics, I suppose. It's part of this doing things in the wrong order. And, what I want is for the party to be doing the right thing. And the important thing for me is talking about the right thing, trying to make the arguments, trying to get us in the right place. And I'm not a kind of party person in the sense that, that's always the priority. Getting the country right and doing the right things for the country are the important thing.
David, thank you very much. Let me come to the floor here. We've got a few questions here. I'll probably take two or three. So could we take the three here along the row, and then I'll come to you, sir, in the next round. So start with this chap in the front row, then behind, and then the lady behind you. If you wouldn't mind just saying who you are, and the rules here, as you probably all know by now, are you can, I really want a question, you can give a speech as long as it's one sentence long and ends in a question mark.
Anthony Bootle, Assistant Head Teacher at Newstead Wood Grammar School. I noticed that none of the three of you mentioned the idea that tax cuts could actually lead to increases in revenue. We don't have to look that far back to the 80s, of course, it happened under Osborne. Why have we stopped talking about that now?
Really interesting. Gentleman behind you. Again, sir, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yes, great question. My name is Ian Bastable. I'm a councillor in Fareham. Isn't the answer to the albatross round your neck the elephant in the room, which is not growth, but actually productivity? Why are we not talking about productivity? In fact, I thought that was the prospectus of the Prime Minister when he was in the election campaign about using the engine of technology and innovation in this country to improve productivity.
Lydia Mrochinska, activist, and you made the connection between the economics and the culture wars that we see going on. How would you give us advice as a Conservative Party to put that into maybe studies, words, in ways that we can convince the British public that the heavy burden on taxes is not just due to an ageing population, it's misspending money on a lot of welfare that we've caused from all of this culture wars, as well as the trans argument, and a lot of money spent on that in the NHS where it might not wisely be spent. How can we put that together in a good argument to convince people that it is an economic argument as well as a culture argument?
So, David, just to refresh you, Anthony asked about essentially the Laffer curve argument.
Yeah.
Well, there now some tax is so high that if you reduce the rate, you could increase revenues. And of course that gets quite complicated. It might not happen over the immediate run, but it could happen over the short to medium run rather than overnight. But have we abandoned that argument? Ian asked about productivity vis-a-vis growth. That, I mean, obviously the two go hand in hand. But I've been absolutely gobsmacked, appalled by the productivity figures in the public sector. I mean, going radically backwards. And then Lydia says, how do we explain this? What's the campaign slogan? I always think the devil has the best tunes. I'm pretty underwhelmed by the conference slogan of, was it long-term decision making for a better future? It sounds like an accountancy firm.
I thought it was a joke.
Right.
I didn't realise it was the actual slogan.
No, it is the actual slogan. So, what's the... how do we improve the way we put the arguments forward? Obviously, a conference slogan is one minimal part of that, but nevertheless a part of it.
Yeah, Laffer curve. I mean, yeah, it's accident. Probably I didn't mention it. We definitely believe in it, and we are surely over the hump of the Laffer curve in a lot of taxes just at the moment. I'm quite convinced that we would raise more revenue quite quickly with cutting taxes as part of a reform programme more broadly. I think productivity, not growth. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no doubt public sector productivity, something's gone badly wrong there. I'm not quite sure what. Could be a bit of a measurement issue. I think there's probably some cultural things going on in the public sector as well. There, of course, the distinction between productivity and growth comes from the number of people you've got in the economy, and persistently per capita growth is about 0.5% below the sort of overall growth figures, and it underlines how much our model is depending on importing people, and I don't think that's sustainable. We have got to get productivity up. I think on the culture wars and all of that, I mean I think you put the argument pretty well yourself, to be honest, that we do need to make the linkage between the two of them. I think in the short run, I believe we need to certainly significantly reform the Equalities Act so that it becomes an anti-discrimination piece of legislation, not a kind of group rights piece of legislation. And that we can say that part of the problem is the vast sums the government spends on promoting diversity, inclusion, all the kind of consequentials that go with that. I mean, it is billions every year, and let's start there. That feels like an easy one to start.
Probably got time for just a few more questions. I did promise this gentleman at the front, then behind you, then right at the back, and then I'll come over to this side.
Ian Barking from Gosport. Thank you for coming to us today. Right at the beginning, you mentioned that you felt that we've lost the argument between large state and small state, and that large state is taking over. Do you think that's true of party members? And if you don't think that's true of the party members, do you think the elected representatives, i.e. they should be listening more to their constituency parties?
Interesting. Thank you.
Ted Granger, President of Nottingham Uni Conservatives. In the way that Liz Truss didn't make the argument, or should have made the argument, about making the decisions about increasing the deficit now to have prosperity in the future. Does the Conservative Party not desperately need to be in opposition in order to have the necessary conversations about returning to free market conservatism?
And then right at the back, gentleman right at the back there.
I just came from the Midland Hotel where there was a queue around the block for Liz Truss's growth, British growth.
Yourself, sir?
Sorry, yeah, Ali Miraj, a broadcaster and commentator. The queue was around the block. It seemed a little confusing to me because it was a 49-day summer internship as PM, ended in humiliation and defeat. So what does that actually say about the state of conservatism and the future of it when you have a queue round the block for an utter failure?
There you go, 3 easy questions there. The large versus small state thing, it does seem from most polling that I've seen that Conservative Party members take a more free market view of policy than Conservative parliamentarians, frankly. I mean, I couldn't exactly chop up which polls I've seen on that, but that seems to indicative of it. You know, is there a way to, if you want the free market side to win, do we need to empower the members more? Ted asked, you know, almost as a period in opposition, you know, now required. Do governments just run out of steam? You need to refresh yourself, you know, rethink, recharge your batteries. Very hard to do that in government. And Ali asks, you know, what's the great popularity of Liz Truss, shortest serving Prime Minister, with, you know, about half of the people in this secure zone seem to be determined to hear her speak.
Large, the influence of party members. How should I put this? I'm not sure that all Conservative Party and parliamentarians have the highest esteem for the opinions of their membership, and I think that might be part of the problem. In my experience, the party membership is definitely sort of pretty Thatcherite in that sense. But you know, when you come to Whitehall and Westminster, you are surrounded by all sorts of other influences that push in the other direction. And if you don't have any strong convictions of your own, then you'll go with the flow. And I think to a large extent that is what's happened with the Parliamentary Party. Opposition, I mean, no, I don't ever want to give up power to the Labour Party, even under its kind of sort of weak form under Keir Starmer. I still think he's going to reinforce a lot of the trends that we're seeing at the moment. So I don't think it's ever good to be in opposition. If we end up in opposition, definitely we need to have this argument properly and settle what the party is about, even though it's going to be quite painful, because I don't think we're going to win unless we do settle what it's about. Liz Truss, the cue for failure. I think, you know, people can see that, as we were saying, you know, aspects of the Liz Truss government were mishandled, but I think there are two reasons why there is still interest. One, people do know that growth is really important, and if we don't have a policy about growth, we're not going to solve the problems. And second, I think there is amongst the party membership a kind of, and they're right to have this view, there is a view, a sort of rather anti-establishment view, a sense that the people who've run the country for the last 20 or 30 years are, you know, have not necessarily produced the best results, that they are not open to challenge, that they think that they are still in the right, and that current of opinion was part of the reason for Liz Truss's eventual defenestration. So I think there is sympathy for her and her government, that she was to some extent a victim of that sort of establishment pushback.
Okay, well, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. There's one at the back over there, and just wait for the microphone.
My name's Richard Knowles. I'm a gardener and a care worker, and I was also a social worker for 20 years. I'm a bit worried about the growth in the health problems, the health profile of the population, both mentally and physically, and whether that's, you know, there's a problem where people are getting stuck. Is there any way that the government, any ideas about how we can incentivise people to sort of move forward in health and get away from welfare and back into maybe part-time work, something that would move them forward?
So this, I think the Chancellor, I didn't study it in detail, has indicated some of this today, that you're going to, you know, a bit of carrot and stick, I think, in terms of getting back into work. But the numbers are pretty jaw-dropping, aren't there? There's 2.6 million people off work permanently sick of working age. I mean, this is one hell of a, I thought we were over the pandemic. I mean, this is one hell of a large number of people. So, you know, is this really happening, or is it a reflection of the system that you can sign off sick more easily? How do we get people working again? Or is there actually a major problem with both physical and mental health, which is, you know, causing so many people to, frankly, be idle rather than be productive?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I don't think there's a simple answer to the question, obviously, and there are a lot of things going on. I think if we had a more European-style insurance-based system generally that had slightly different incentives in the system, maybe you would see some improvements in public health. I think there are obviously some deeper trends in Western society that are contributing to obesity and so on that I don't think are well understood. I think people reach for the solutions, whether it's sort of ultra processed food or big food companies or whatever the latest fad is, but I think they are displacement activity rather than a real thing. I mean, I think that the truth is that even modern wealthy economies like ours can't afford to keep sort of 5 million of the workforce permanently idle at everybody's expense. And I don't know whether there is a mental health problem or not. I don't know whether everybody who isn't working necessarily can't work, but I think we do need probably a bit more stick as well as carrot to test that out. And I just think the reality is that if we are going to continue growing, we need to expand the workforce again, and that's just the way it is, unfortunately.
Let me just finish very quickly with a question from the chair. What's the one thing that you would really like to hear from? What are you looking for? What commitment or what tone or what pledge?
So I would say three things. One, please paint us a picture of how Conservative Britain, if we win again, is different from Labour Britain. What is your vision of society? How should it work? What's the role of government? What's the role of the individual? What is Conservative Britain about? You always knew that with Mrs Thatcher, what she wanted to create, and we're not getting that. The two other specific things, I would like us to commit to a tax cut before the next election and the spending cuts that go with it, because I think it's an important piece of credibility to the overall offer. And third, I would like a proper sort of red team fundamental look at the net zero project. At the moment it's captured by believers in government, and nobody can tell whether we're doing the right things or not. We need a fundamental root and branch look at that by people who we can trust.
There you go. There's our bingo card for Rishi's speech at noon on Wednesday then, unless you're one of the people fleeing back because of the train strike on Wednesday. David, it's been an absolutely fascinating hour. Thank you very much for those thoughts and insights, and I'm sure everybody in this room hopes that you have a key role to play in the future of Conservatism. You've been one of the most thoughtful individuals in recent British politics in trying to frame a new agenda. So we wish you all of the success with that. For those of you in the room, thank you for your contributions. Our next session here starts at 2 o'clock on the future of rail, so please join us for that. That's been a controversial area in the last couple of weeks. Maybe there'll be an HS2 announcement on Wednesday. That would be a way to leave Manchester with a bang, wouldn't it? So please do join us for that. But most importantly, please join me in giving a very warm thanks to Lord David Frost. David, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.